Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to. And perhaps I'm an unusual person in that I actually had a constitution that meant quite a lot to me, so I was immediately able to respond to this. So the constitution I'm speaking of is the 2005 Iraqi constitution that was actually developed under the U.S. occupation of Iraq. As you all know, and if you'd forgive me a little bit of history, in March 2003, the United States led a global coalition to topple the regime of Saddam Hussein, who had by then ruled Iraq for 24 brutal years. I was born right in the middle of his rule, right after a failed uprising that my father was exiled as a result of, the city of my birth was toppled because of, and I moved to the United States. And even as a child in the U.S., Saddam Hussein was the stuff of nightmares for me. His reach extended beyond borders. I had to be careful when I spoke in Arabic in any Arab country. And I had to be careful even when I spoke on the phone to my family back home. He haunted everyone I knew, every Iraqi adult that I knew, and every child. He seemed invincible and immortal, which is why when the U.S. did invade Iraq in 2003, it was not met with universal opposition. Quite the contrary, when I visited in June 2003, only a mere months after American tanks had rolled into Baghdad, I sensed something in the air that as an adult I struggle with a lot, but as a child I understood innately. It was jubilation and hope. It was only later that I understood that multiple truths can exist at once and be competing, that Iraq could be illegally invaded and occupied, bombed and degraded, the horrors of which we're only discovering today, almost more than 20 years later. And at the same time, Iraqis could be experiencing a moment of relief and respite, and that Saddam Hussein's toppling and later his execution was a relief and an end to the pain. I've never in my life again felt such an environment of political possibility, such an excitement about political change that I did in 2003 and 2004. Perhaps the reason it was so heightened was that I was a child and I didn't understand the complexity of my own positionality, the community I came from, the myriad Iraqi communities that had different opinions at the time. But, this ultimately all erupted in a civil war in 2005. But right before that war, there was a constitution that was demanded to be written early by Iraqis, despite the U.S.'s intentions of waiting longer to provide it. And the Iraqis did demand it. They succeeded at writing it, and they were able to vote on it a lot earlier than had been scheduled by the occupation. To me, this constitution would always represent the moment of political hope that I hadn't seen since then. The constitution marked the end of an era of dictatorship and the promise of an era of democracy. And despite it being developed under U.S. occupation, it was voted on and written and encouraged by Iraqis as a means of reasserting control over their own country and their own future, which arguably they had lost for decades. The Constitution, of course, carried the trauma of the past. It outlawed the Ba'ath Party, which had been the party of Saddam Hussein. It attempted to undo historic traumas. It was the first constitution in the world to include Kurdish as an official language of state. It also protected women's representation in parliament, which is a first. It allowed women to pass on their citizenship to their children, which is an oddity among Middle Eastern countries. And most importantly to me, it was voted on by a committee that was voted by the Iraqi public, and the election turnout was 76.4%. That was the first democratic election in Iraq's history. Iraq is said to have only existed since it was established by the British, but it is a 6,000-year-old nation prior to that. At the time, I didn't realize that I was experiencing so many political firsts. I was experiencing the first democratic vote, like I said. I was experiencing the first constitution that was written by a representative group of Iraqis. I was experiencing the first transition from authoritarianism to democratization in Iraq's history. I had no idea. I thought this was what politics was like. And despite the immense challenges that emerged in Iraq after and that continue to this day, the Iraqi Constitution of 2005 will always symbolize hope for me and that moment of renewal and the assertion of self-determination. The process of creating that constitution, including the role of the clerics in Iraq, which was controversial at the time, but they advocated for it. It was a source of intellectual inspiration for me. It's why I became a political scientist and why I'm here today. At the same time, it was the knowledge of the pain that had preceded this constitution, the price of democracy, if you will, that pushes me to continue to defend the Iraqi democracy in writing and in advocacy in every way I can, despite the fact that many people have given up on this. I witnessed the sacrifice, the bloodshed that preceded this document and that laid the groundwork for it. I'll never forget the feeling of political renewal. And at the time, I didn't know it was so rare to feel hope politically. And today I look at both Iraq and the United States and I understand how scarce a commodity political hope is. I'll end by reiterating what AJ was saying, that you don't really need to look so far into the past as he has done to realize that, democracy is hard-earned. You just need to look around you and not sacrifice it. Thank you.
Thanks.